Well, you may remember back, of course, in May, we were talking about the lead up to the local elections and the fact that it was going to be the first election where we had the introduction of voter ID. And we were warning about all the problems that were going to occur, and to no one's surprise, what happened? Huge problems. Voters turned away, over 14,000 voters turned away. And obviously, this was a local election. And I must stress, local elections have very, very, very low turnout. The average turnout rate for a local election is around 20 to 25%. So those are very, very low turnout numbers. But of course, we've got a general election around the corner, and voter ID is going to be there. So now you've got a potential turnout going from 20 to 25 up to about 40 to 45. That can be double, or even in cases even more, for general elections. How many more people and disruption is this voter ID going to cause? And even the Conservatives knows it has hurt them. You had Jacob Rees-Mogg even say himself, yeah, it hurt us because it turned away people who would vote for us. And we had a recent study from the Electoral Commission turn around and say, yeah, unemployed and ethnic minorities were the biggest group of affected people. And if you want to help alleviate these problems, here's what you need to do. So we're going to go over this article because it highlights, once again, the serious problem at a general election voter ID is going to do. So once again, expect me when we are in the run-up to a general election to start telling you and to start spreading videos about, hey, if you're going to vote in a general election, then these are the IDs that you can use as ID. This is what you need to do if you get turned away, etc., as we were doing in the May local election. So it's really important, once again, that we spread that message about voter ID and the IDs that you will need to use when it comes to a general election. Because I can guarantee you now, if the Electoral Commission has said this is going to cause widespread disruption and cause thousands of people not to vote, well, the Tories are going to look at that and go, might that be useful for us? So this is something we have to worry about and have to warn people about, and we have to start now. Because if we don't, we could get to a general election and people could find, I don't have the right ID to go and vote. And remember, 14,000 people, 14,000 at the last general election, at the last local election. How many people could it be at a general election that can't cast their votes, where you have, as we said, even more people turn out because it's a general election? So before we go diving into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, which buy me coffee. But of course, there is the YouTube thank you button, and of course, there is the Pony Club link down below as well. And of course, it is Pony Club video today. I think it will already be out. But yes, if you are, like I say, on the Patreon or a Pony Club member, like I say, that video will be out for you to watch today. So let's go diving into this. Because again, I think it's a message well worth spreading. So this comes from the BBC with the title of Voter ID. General election could face serious disruption. So next year, we'll see the first general election where all voters will have to show a valid form of photo ID. The government claims the system will crack down on potential voter fraud. Well, we barely had any voter fraud before. It was just not a problem. Virtually no one got arrested for voter fraud. The instances of voter fraud taking place were minuscule. And very often it was like an old woman whose partner had died and he'd already filled out the form, and then she went and posted it on his behalf even though he had died. That's the kind of stuff that went on in this, quote, voter fraud. It was played up to try and pass this bill when, as we said before, in reality, our elections were very, very safe. But that's what they had to do to try and pass this bill. But electoral administrators surveyed by the Local Government Information Unit have warned that they will not have enough staff to implement the new rules without more funding. Of course, a Tory's going to fund this. Of course, they're not. So, about 14,000 people were unable to vote at May's local elections in England because they did not have a valid ID. And the Electoral Commission's research found that about 90% of voters at May's elections were satisfied with the process of voting. The Electoral Commission has said that the true figure is thought to be higher, as some of those who wanted to vote at polling stations might have been turned away after reading the requirements at the entrance, but were not formally recorded. And we said that back then, 14,000. I suspect it's a lot higher, as does the Electoral Commission, because as we were warning on voting day, if you go to a polling station and you forgot your ID, if someone comes along checking your ID, as we had heard, and they say, "Oh no, you haven't got ID, you can't vote," ignore them and go to the until you get given your poll card. That's the point where you cannot vote because you don't have that. Because at that point, that's when you get recorded. If you leave that line, they ain't recording you. So we knew this was going on in the May's local election. So it could be the true figure could be even higher. So remember at the local May's the next general election, if you go and you do not have a valid form of ID, or at least you take along what you think's a valid form of ID, and then someone tells you it's not, that you can't vote, don't leave the line, stay in it. Make sure that you are recorded, because that's what needs to happen. And I do hope that Labour undo this voter ID rule, because our elections were fine before. We did not need voter ID before. It was brought in by the Tories in an attempt to try and suppress the vote. So, continues. The Electoral Commission said that the true figure was thought to be higher. Not recorded. Ethnic minorities and unemployed voters were more likely to be turned away, the electoral watchdog had found. On a report on Wednesday, the Commission calls for the government to expand the list of accepted ID documents to remove barriers to voting. The government said it is still, quote, learning lessons. Well, gee, our government learning lessons. That would be a first from May's initial rollout of voter ID rules. But two separate reports published on Wednesday have raised serious concerns. The Local Government Institute Investigation Unit report warns that voters will be turned away at the general elections next year because there will not be enough staff to check valid ID and the procedure and produce voter authenticity certificates. So that's the first problem. More funding from central government was needed to ensure that the electoral administration have the resources that they need to make sure that elections happen, said Jonathan Carr West, the chief executive of the unit in a network of over 2,000 local authorities. It is still not clear that voter ID brings any benefits to the process, and indeed, the worries highlighted in our interviews are not addressed by the policy, he added. Ever since this was beginning, ever since it begins, this discussion was had. All the people who were experts in this said it's not going to bring any benefits. It's not going to help the process at all. But they brought it in anyway. Why? Because the Republicans do it in America and it helps suppress the vote, especially those people who do not vote for them. Because guess what? All those IDs were specifically targeted at their people who would do that. So this is something that needs to really just be gotten rid of, because we had fine. The election process that we had was fine before. Why do we suddenly need to bring in ID? We didn't need it before, and our elections worked fine. Election fraud was barely an issue. But he continues. Elections are an essential part of our democracy. Members of the public need to be certain that they are secure, inclusive, and well organized, and most crucially, that the results represent their genuine preferences about how the country should be run. The local government association echoed this view, saying that the council election teams had to rely on help from areas without elections in May. This would have not been sustainable at a general election. In a separate report, the Electoral Commission calls on the government to expand the list of accepted ID documents to remove the barriers to voting. The Commission also suggested allowing voters to cast their ballot without accepted ID if another registered voter could vouch for their identity. Labour's shadow minister for democracy, Florence Elsham, said that it was wrong that the Conservatives have snatched away the ability of legitimate voters to have a say in the services and society. The government must urgently respond to these reasonable proposals by the Electoral Commission and recognise the potential for much wider damage to democracy at a general election if they fail to take action. Speaking for the government elections of this minister, Baroness Scott said, "We are continuing to try and ensure that everyone has the opportunity to have a say in our democracy, and we are ensuring that we are fully understand how the policy has operated in practice and what has gone well, and where there are areas for improvement in the future." The local survey surveyed over 171 electoral administrators who helped to deliver the May 2023 local elections. And the survey found that 9 out of 10 administrators reported problems recruiting enough staff for the polling station. That's incredibly worrying. And of course, 8 out of 10 administrators surveyed reported that the new rules had made recruiting and retaining polling staff even much more difficult. Wow. Tory policy causing a disaster that everyone predicted would happen. Imagine my shock. Imagine my shock. Yeah. We predicted this would happen. And of course, at the local election, we are going to have to make sure that we sound the alarm and that we spread the news of if you are going to vote, then these are the IDs that you need. And to make sure you have these IDs. And of course, the voter authentication certificate. We need to start raising the alarm for people if they do not have those IDs, that they can get those certificates early enough to be able to do that. Now, the best thing, of course, would be to just get rid of this voter ID completely. It was not necessary in the first place. As we said, this was brought in by the Conservatives because they want to try and suppress the vote. And the IDs that were specifically chosen were chosen expressly for that. When you can see that unemployed and ethnic minority people most affected by this, it's 14,000. The Electoral Commission says that's probably even higher. At a general election, even more people are going to turn out to vote. This voter ID rule, completely pointless, should be gotten rid of. And it should be gotten rid of at the first possible opportunity. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.